welcome to the studio. Today I've taken this daily warm-up piece and transformed it. This piece has some interesting marks on it, and I do like the color palette. I like the blue and the orange, but the piece overall I find a bit boring. Sometimes it's hard to pinpoint why I don't like a piece of art that I've made or what it's missing, how to resolve it. Usually, when I get into this position, the first thing I do is take a picture of the piece. Then I flip to the mono filter on the camera. Now, just looking at the value, it's easy to see why I don't really like what I've done so far. Primarily, I've used all midtones. There's a little bit of white, and the marks look great, but there's really nothing that is, there's not enough contrast in this piece. It looks flat. Essentially, it's really just a background, and the lack of value doesn't give my eye a focal point or a place to follow or look around the piece. There are a number of ways that I could resolve this. I could use a darker value and add to what's here, but in the end I decided to create a brand new color palette, something that would inspire me and ensure that that color palette had dark values, midtones, and light values. One of the artists that I love is a pioneer in abstract art, Helmut Klint. She painted a series of really large, like 8 by 10 foot paintings in the very early 1900s called the 10 Largest. And it really was groundbreaking. What I did was looked at and analyzed some of those paintings to create the color palette on the left-hand side. And I'm working now toward creating my own spin on that color palette, but really being inspired by the colors that Clint used in that series of paintings. I'm also creating different value sets within each of these colors. You'll see on the greens there that I've created the initial value and then have either added a little bit of orange to create a little bit darker value or added white to create lighter variations as well. So then I set myself a 10-minute timer and just started to play again on top of the base layer that I already had here. And I set that 10-minute timer so that I wasn't too precious about how I was applying these new colors. You'll see as I'm painting the green and pink, I'm trying to put contrasting values next to each other to create more interest. And I really end up liking that blue kind of mixes with the more olive green. And you'll see on the finished piece, I really come up with like a sea glass green that I end up using, or that ends up on the finished piece that I really like. That really wasn't part of the initial color palette. It's just some of these colors mixed together created new fun surprises that I really loved how it turned out. Here I'm still just applying and playing, starting to look at what's emerging, starting to see a bit of a landscape. Wanted to add some of that bright yellow just to liven up some of the colors and create contrast next to that deeper green. Here again, I'm adding some yellow next to that green just to create some contrast. And then I realized that the shape on the right is very similar to the shape on the left, so I kind of cover some of that up. And you'll see on the palette that I'm actually mix these colors a little bit together, really harmonizing these colors. So I'll add a little bit of another color into the orange before I use it, or a little bit of the yellow into the blue, and it just harmonizes these colors so that they look like they have some relationship to one another. Now I'm scraping into the painting because there's so many layers on this piece at this point that I've got my favorite scraping tools out, and I'm really starting to draw into the paint. I'm envisioning grasses and trees and leaves and really liking the way that some of that looks. This is another one of my favorite tools. This is a clay tool, and I use this to scrape into the paint. These are a fine set of tweezers where I'm creating branches and trunks of trees. Again, I'm scraping down almost to the paper. That clay tool is used to rough up two pieces of clay and use slip to adhere them together. It's got like little, like 4 or 5 metal spines on the end of that clay, and it works great for this process. Now I'm adding permanent black ink, just highlighting tree trunks and branches, giving a little bit more contrast. Here I'm creating shadows just to give a little bit more definition to some of the paths that I'm seeing, and grasses, trees. I'm really starting to enjoy the landscape that's emerging, and you'll see here I've signed it thinking I'm done. But then I was thinking it would be great to have some pastels added to the top layer. But because I've put so much paint now on here, acrylic paint, the pastels won't adhere to that acrylic paint. So I've used a clear gesso that, once dry, it will give the paper like a sandpaper gritty finish, so that when I add the soft pastels on top, they'll have something to grip to. I'm trying to show here the grit. So now I'm just validating that I don't want to really necessarily bring in too many new colors, more just add a little bit more texture through the use of these pastels. I'll also use these pastels to add a little bit more detail. Then I've selected some violet just to add a bit of cool tones, because most of my palette at this point are warmer tones, just to give it a bit of contrast. Here I'm just adding some details with the pastels. I don't usually add pastels to my work, but I really enjoyed using them on this piece, and the texture that it created and the little details that you can see close up. Here I'm just adding some of that orangey rust color, trying to make sure that the tree trunks and branches are kind of integrated and don't just appear to be sitting on top of the painting. Just some highlights with that brighter orange. Now I'm just adding some of the colors from the sky down in the bottom of the painting, just for a little bit of continuity. And here I'm trying to blend in the sky a little bit more, just to have it be a little bit quieter, so it doesn't compete with some of the other details. Here I'm going to use this really buttery, kind of creamy color, just to add some highlights next to where the branches and tree trunks are, just to provide a bit of light and more contrast to some of those darker areas as well. Here I'm just adding a bit of kind of an olive green, some rust, just to insinuate fallen leaves. And usually where I use one color on one side of the painting, I like to add it to another side as well. So that's why you kind of see me working back and forth. Here I'm using that brighter aqua color just to highlight the darkness of the trees. And then this dark teal color to highlight the lightness of some of the, where I envision light hitting some of the branches and the ground. I don't want to add a lot or be too heavy-handed. Just want to add a little bit of detail. Here I'm feeling that on the right-hand side, it's a little bit too dark. So I'm adding a little bit of lighter green just to, again, give it different values. There's some highlights in the trees and next to the branches, kind of going back and forth with light and dark. Now I'm using a bit of a violet color. Instead of using white, I'm using violet to show different highlights. And then this deeper, more saturated violet. Just going back in with a little bit of black, just to put a little bit more emphasis on some of the branches, provide a little bit more contrast. turning the page just to make sure that now I'm getting the movement in more of a horizontal fashion in the center, just to kind of show rolling hills. Using a brighter green just to again continue to give a little bit more dimension. I blended that out. I thought it was a little bit too much. And going back in with violet, just to add a hint to it, so that that cool next to the warm colors creates again a bit of contrast. And again, I sign it thinking I'm done, but I'm not. One of the tools that I use is a mat. I have studio mats that I take a look at the final piece when I think it's done, just to really look at the composition. And what I see is dead center, that blob of really light sea glass blue. I think it stands out too much. So I'm going back in with the pastels and trying to just integrate it a bit more so it's not the first thing your eye sees when you look at this piece. So I'm just blending that in a little bit more so it's not the focal point, but I still have a lot of that light in the center where I would imagine the sun is hitting the ground and the trees. I think this looks much more resolved now. And here's a look at the final piece. And close up so you can see the texture. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you next time.